Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Falk, President of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth, and I want to welcome viewers from C-SPAN and members of World Affairs Councils from across the country. I think you're going to especially enjoy today's conversation with Jia Lynn Yang. She's the author of a new book, One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, The Epic Struggle Over American Immigration. And that is certainly an issue that is discussed daily, isn't it? We're reminded that the United States has been and continues to be a nation that welcomes immigrants on one hand and then turns them away depending on the shifting national mood and political will. Jia will be in conversation today with Laura Collins. Laura is the director of the Bush Institute-SMU Economic Growth Initiative that's based here in Dallas at the George W. Bush Institute. Today's program is sponsored by Paige Hendricks Public Relations. I hope that you'll purchase a copy of Jia's book, and you can do that by going to our strategic partner, an independent bookstore, Interabang Books. And you can purchase a book at interabangbooks.com, and you can get a 10% discount if you'll type into the code dfwworld. And I hope that you'll support your independent bookstore, whether it's in Interabang or wherever you live. Let me tell you a little bit about Jia Lynn Yang. She's the Deputy National Editor at the New York Times. She's been there since, it's been about 3 years. She joined in September 2017. Prior to joining the Times, she was with the Washington Post. She was Deputy National Security Editor, and she was part of a team that won the Pulitzer. They won it for its coverage of President Trump and Russia. Jia is known for her really wide range of reporting, which includes as well covering Edward Snowden's escape to Hong Kong. She's a family of immigrants and is a graduate of Yale University. And so with that, Laura, I turn the mic over to you, and I look forward to listening to your conversation.
Thank you so much to the World Affairs Council for having us all here today. In recent days, all of us have been examining the character of our nation through the eyes of the oppressed and disenfranchised. We must continue to listen to their voices, and we must support them. And now for today's programming. Thank you so much, Jia Lynn, for being here with us. As Jim mentioned, the book is called A Mighty and Irresistible Tide. It's about immigration policy and really the changes that happened from 1924 to 1965. Because I work in immigration policy, I think about the 1965 law all the time. But I imagine most Americans don't. And I imagine even though you work in journalism and you're very connected to current events, you probably don't think about it a lot on a day-to-day basis either. Can you give us a sense of what inspired you to write this book and really how you got interested in the 1965 law?
Thanks so much for having me. It's such an honor to talk to all of you, and it's just a pleasure to be together right now. So I got really interested kind of on a fluke. I was in Austin, Texas for a friend's wedding and wanted to go to the LBJ Presidential Museum and Library just to check it out. I love reading histories about LBJ. I love reading histories about the 60s in the US, such an eventful time. And it's, as I'm sure many of you all know, being in Texas, it's not hard to get to that museum. And so I went, and there's this room that some of you may know that basically outlines all of the legislation that LBJ passed, which is just, there's an enormous body of work there, right? He passes Medicare, Medicaid, he does this, public broadcasting and PBS is from him. And then I also noticed there was a line about this law from 1965 on immigration that I have to confess, I had not, maybe I'd been taught it in high school, but I'd long forgotten it. It's called the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. And I got interested because there's in that room, it mentions it, and then there's a line below it that says, this law helps explain why there are so many Asian Americans in our country right now. And I thought, I wonder if my family's connected, because my parents came from China and Taiwan. They came in the late 60s and 70s for school, for college and graduate school. And they stayed after, and they decided to build a life in Northern Virginia outside DC in Alexandria. That's where I was born in 1982. And so I thought, if we came after 1965, maybe we're connected. And so I went and began to look, and sure enough, and the more I learned, the more I realized that this law, which banned discrimination based on race and ethnicity in our immigration laws, helps explain why my family's here, why so many families are here. And it's in the news all the time, because when President Trump talks about family reunification, or chain migration is a term I think is really in circulation now, especially among conservatives who want to restrict immigration. They're talking about this law. This is the law that began all of that. And so this law explains, for me, like what we're debating every day when the White House comes out with more immigration proposals. It's also about the very nature of our country, because our demographics are transforming so rapidly. We've never had this much immigration from outside Europe. This law is why. So I just got really sucked into this kind of journey of examining, in a way, like family history. You know, it's a different kind of genealogy. It's not sort of like, where was my great grandfather born? It's about, why is my family even in this country? You know, even leaving aside the question of should we have been allowed here at all, and those kinds of moral questions. I just wanted to know, like, we turn away so many families in this country. We have, and we still are. Why was my family allowed to come versus somebody else? And what's the history behind it? So that's how I got into it. It was just it was for very personal reasons.
When you talk about, the reasons that your family was able to come here, in immigration policy, we like to think about push factors and pull factors. And it's kind of an interesting conversation, because if you are anti-immigrant or anti-reform, a lot of what you focus on are the pull factors. You know, is it the entitlement system that's bringing people here? You know, but when we look at past waves of immigration, we often focus on the push factors. What made people want to leave? And, I think your book really sort of calls into question whether it was really push factors or what the situation on the ground was that compelled people to come here. So can you talk to me a little bit about how our domestic political situation really impacts immigration from abroad?
So I think one thing that struck me learning this is, like, when you hear the debate right now, you hear kind of the same arguments being repeated. And we sort of imagine that our immigration system has always looked the way that it does right now, when in fact, my book begins in the 1920s. We didn't have a visa system. You didn't need a visa to get here. And again, some of you in the audience, if you think about sort of how your families came, depending on when they came, if they came before 1924, if you can make the journey to come here, you get here and you show up at Ellis Island or another port, maybe Galveston. Also, people came through there. And you really just came, and a very small percentage of people were turned away. We would inspect your health and sort of very basic things at these ports, but vast majority of people were allowed in. We had a literacy test that was added in 1917, but vast majority of people passed that. If you came, there wasn't really a mechanism for deporting people. So that idea that we sort of take for granted now, that we have active deportations, like that was, unheard of. And I think for a lot of people, sort of unthinkable. The US-Mexico border was essentially open. There were no restrictions numerically on who could come. So I just think this history is really important to understand, that, like, when we talk about, we tend to, I think of a nation of immigrants, like there's the static idea. And depending on when your family came, maybe you came from Germany, right, in the mid 1800s. Maybe you came, your family came as part of the Irish wave, or later the Jewish or Italian wave that came, after 1880. And then now we talk about people coming from, Latin America and Asia. We sort of tend to think of it as this, like, consistent, same story, just different characters. And I think what's important to know domestically is, like, our laws keep changing. And so who comes depends on these laws. And it's not just, can you physically make the journey, which was what was true from the very beginning of our country. It's increasingly been, for the last 100 years, do you fit these criteria? Do you have the right papers, right? And I just think it's important when we have this debate now, you hear people say things like, well, my family came the right way, these people are coming the wrong way. The way that people come is changing. And we kind of collectively, as a democracy, keep debating, who can come and who do we want even here? And I think these questions are very unresolved. But my book is all about how we wrestle with that and how the answers to these questions keep changing over time.
Yeah, I know for my own family, my great-grandmother is from Romania, and she came through Ellis Island, and she came before the 1924 law, which essentially shut down, for all intents and purposes, Eastern European immigration. And so, we really were fortunate in that, I probably wouldn't be here, because the odds of her getting in were pretty slim. And, she was illiterate, functionally so, and she had very little formal education. And I've looked actually at the ship's manifest, and I think if I recall correctly, they ask what your ambition is coming to the United States. And I think she said she wanted to be a homemaker. And that's what she ended up doing. She did end up raising her family here. I don't think we would, in current immigration law, say, oh, you want to be a homemaker? Come on in. It's great, right? That's just not how the law works anymore. So I want to touch on that 1924 law, though, because you mentioned, we didn't have a visa system even before that. What was sort of the driving force behind the 1924 law, and how did it fundamentally change immigration in the United States?
It's such an important law. It's, it comes as a response. And again, there's so many parallels with right now. Once you begin to learn, you're like, oh, this just sounds so familiar to me. So it comes in response to a historic wave of immigration that's coming in. And like now, it's a historic high in terms of the percentage of foreign-born Americans. And unlike now, these are people from Mexico or Asia, it's people from Italy, from Eastern Europe, from Russia. And, you were talking about push and pull factors. These are people escaping persecution, poverty, and they start showing up at Ellis Island in these just no one's seen waves like this before of people who seem really different from the people who've come before. They speak different languages, they worship different religions, they're Catholic, they're Jewish, they just seem really different. And part of the concerns at the time were, wait a second, we are a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation. These people don't fit that. And they're changing our country too quickly. They're not assimilating properly. And this is not what America is. It's changing too much, and we've got to put a stop to this. And so support really builds for a law in 1924 to basically bring the gates down and say, we don't want people like this anymore. And the reason it has so much force and why it's such an important law to understand is that up to this point, the country is quite open to immigration. There are very important exceptions to know. For instance, for my family, because we're from China, there's the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which says we don't want Chinese laborers anymore. But aside from that, it really is largely quite open. And this law passes because people are seeing all these immigrants coming into the cities and changing them overnight. And they also have the science of eugenics behind them. Whereas, this is very mainstream at the time. This is before the Holocaust. And people are literally ranking and assessing and studying different ethnicities and saying, okay, if you're Italian, if you're of the Italian race, they would use that word in this context, you are more prone to criminality, or we've studied who's in our mental institutions, and people from these countries tend to be here and other people aren't here. And so they're studying these ethnicities like a science. They're looking at genetics and eugenics. And so they pass this law because they say, first of all, these people are changing our democracy too quickly. And look, there's the science that says these ethnicities are less desirable than others. We're not being racist. We're looking at the science. We've studied the data. And this is what we've determined about different ethnicities. And so they basically pass a law that says, we don't want people from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe anymore. We don't want people from Asia. They can't assimilate. And we need to get back to what our country was from the beginning, which is, again, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. That's what we want. And the law succeeds exactly as planned. Overnight, people stop coming to Ellis Island because, again, you need a visa now. You can't just sort of show up and say, like, I'm here, like I'm ready to join the American project. You need papers that you didn't need before. And the nature of the people coming, the foreign-born percentage just drops overnight. And what's amazing to me is we think of ourselves, again, as we've always been a nation of immigrants. Well, these are years going into really the 60s, deep into the 60s, where the percentage of immigrants just falls and falls and falls. And the only immigrants around are people who are old. They came, in that last wave at the turn of the 20th century. There aren't new people coming in. And so there are even historians and people saying in the 50s, like, immigration, like, we don't even talk about it anymore because it's just not a part of American culture. It's not this political and social force that's changing our country the way we think about it now. It really just kind of falls off the radar as an issue, really, because there literally aren't that many immigrants. And it's all because of this 1924 law.
You mentioned unintended consequences of the 1964 bill. There were a lot of unintended consequences to 1924, particularly as we start to see World War II really ramp up in Europe and see what the Nazis were doing, particularly to Jews. And so what were the unintended consequences for our domestic immigration policy from that law as we start to enter this wartime period?
So what's interesting too is 1924 is passed in a very isolationist moment, right? The country has fought World War I. People have sort of deep regrets about it and feel like, why did we even get involved in Europe at all? And so we are in this moment of real like retrenching, isolationist, 100% America, like we're not going to concern ourselves with the rest of the world. And then World War II happens, and suddenly we overnight, and in ways that we're still grappling with now, I think, become global actors, right? We sort of come out of our hole and we're like, we are part of, the global stage. We have moral obligations to other countries. And so when the Second World War is happening, there's this huge demand for people to be able to flee Nazi Germany and Nazi forces on the march in Eastern Europe. And what prevents them from being able to come? It's these quotas that were passed in the 1920s. So there's this huge sort of tumult, especially among Jewish Americans who are saying, oh my goodness, our people are being slaughtered in the Holocaust and we cannot find room for them here. This is a tragedy. And there are literally stories of ships that show up at our shores filled with refugees, and we turn them away because they don't have the right papers. We don't have room for them. We have these quotas and they cannot come. And so after the war, this continues because there's a massive refugee crisis. Again, not unlike the worldwide refugee crisis we see right now. And this begins to add kind of moral urgency to thinking about these immigration laws and saying we need to update them. We are now a global actor on the stage. We're fighting a Cold War now after World War II. We need to if we fought for freedom in this war, how can we now turn around and not admit these refugees? And so that's what begins people really kind of reassessing these quotas and saying, maybe we don't want these quotas. Maybe these quotas have problems. And again, part of it too, you have to understand, is during the Holocaust and there's eugenics powering all this anti-Semitism. So after the war, people are like, we can't defend laws that were based on eugenics. This has totally fallen out of favor. It's morally indefensible. It's racist. We've got to change our laws. So this is a period of time where the quotas kind of come up against reality and how the country is changing, and people feel like they have become outdated.
So one of the questions we have, and I want to get deeper into this later, but asks us to explain what the 1965 immigration law is, which I think it's probably a good idea to give us a brief overview of what that is and how it changed immigration law. And then we can get into more depth later, but just so the audience has an idea of why there was this big change.
1965 abolishes the quotas from 1924. So to understand the significance of 1965, you have to know that that whole battle is all about getting rid of these ethnic quotas. So, right, the country up until 1965 has these very sharp numerical caps. So for instance, you can only have 100 people from China every year because, again, the Chinese are less desirable. They're not the people that we want. We are going to allow many, many more from England, from Germany, for instance. But if you're from these other countries, we don't really want you. And so there are these numerical caps. And based on who you are, your ethnicity, that's what largely determines if you can come into the country. 1965 says that system is, it's discriminatory. We're not doing that anymore. We're going to use a totally different set of criteria. And no longer, if you're going to try to come to this country, we're not looking first at your ethnicity. That's off the table. We're looking at things like, do you have family here? Do you have special job skills? That's how we're going to decide whether you should come and be part of this country.
And I would add to that, our immigration system is fundamentally the same as it was since 1965. There have been some tweaks around the edges. We've changed a little bit of the way the system works, but by and large, we are still overwhelmingly based on family reunification, which is part of what has driven this wave of Asian immigration because, there weren't as many European immigrants who were bringing their families over at that point in time. And so with that opening and changing of the quota system, giving people from other parts of the world the opportunity to come here, and then they started bringing family members. That's really fundamentally where we're at today. And you don't see that in a lot of the countries that are similar to us in terms of government and economy. A lot of those systems are really focused on skills, education, and what are you going to bring to our economy? We still really focus on family in a way that is an outlier. And that's all because of this 1965 law.
Yeah. And I think what's so interesting to me is, if you think about the debate now, the Democratic Party is very much for family reunification. They say it's a humanitarian, instinct. If you look at the history, they're debating. So if we're going to get rid of these ethnic quotas, right? If we're not going to base whether you come in on what country you're coming from or the color of your skin, we're going to use other criteria. And there's a whole fight over, so what is the criteria? And the reason why family reunification comes in is not to diversify the country. It's in fact coming from people who are skeptical of immigration saying, well, there aren't that many of the people that we don't want here right now, because again, right, immigration has really fallen off the map. So if we control immigration and say, if you already have family here, you're more likely to come, that's a way to preserve the status quo. That's a way to keep America white, because they're looking around, there aren't that many Asian immigrants. So they think, actually, this is a way to keep the country from diversifying more. Because every time we discuss immigration, on the table is this question of ethnicity and race, right? Like, what culturally do we want our country to look like? And for the people in 65, family reunification was a way to control the racial makeup of the country and to preserve it and to keep it more white. And of course, that backfires for them. And now what we have is, Lauren's right, the primary driving factor for why our country is so racially diverse now from immigration is because of this very thing that was supposed to keep us more white. So that part, when I learned that, it just tells you how little we understand how we got here, I think.
And I think a lot of times in policymaking, we sometimes don't think fully through what the unintended consequences are. And they're not always bad unintended consequences, but they do drive us to what our next reforms have to be, right? And they do drive us to the way the political situation reacts in the future. I want to touch a little bit on that with this next audience question, which asks, we've always had some xenophobia as part of immigration, but in other areas, have there been policies such as family separation or remain in Mexico, or attitudes towards refugees and asylum seekers? I think we've touched on this a little bit, but I would say in reading the book, we've definitely had some policies that would shock the conscience now.
In terms of being anti-immigration, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think the 1924 law is just really worth understanding for us, which is that we basically said, and people literally said this, the famous Emma Lazarus poem about the huddled masses of that's at the Statue of Liberty. People literally said, we are not doing the melting pot anymore. We're not doing the huddled masses thing anymore. We don't. And actually the idea that we kind of take for granted now that we have a refugee policy. We had no refugee policy. That only happens after World War II with Harry Truman. And so we really very much said, this is going to be, to put it bluntly, like a white ethno state. We don't want that. We want to base who comes here based on race and ethnicity. And that was explicit in our laws. And that was true for 40 years. And I think what's so important to me about understanding this, again, in the modern context, is that, I have to say, I spent 4 years working on this book. I don't myself have great answers for what our immigration system should look like. I think it's really complicated. And I even look at my own family and I think, like, should we have had priority over, a penniless refugee fleeing political persecution? Like, I'm not sure the answer is yes. And I don't have, answers for what our system should look like. But I do feel like what I have learned is that over time, we don't have a static system. We don't have a static idea of whether we are a nation of immigrants. And so the dial for how many immigrants we allow in, who we allow in, our notion of what makes someone American, that changes over time, and it can be changed again. And so if 24 is kind of a really big marker for we are going to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation, 1965 is this opposite pole, right, that says, no, we're not going to base our country on, the color of your skin. It's going to be about something else. It's going to be about family and job skills. We are again at a moment of debating, what kind of country do we want to be? And people in the White House, I'd argue, really know this history. So people like Jeff Sessions, people like Stephen Miller, they know about the 1924 law. They know about 1965. And you'll see in comments and past sometimes they'll say things like, they'll praise 1924 and they'll criticize 1965. And so for them, they understand this history, that that is a dial that you change back and forth. And I just think that what I've learned is that our democracy has a lot of work to be done about thinking through, like, who do we want here? What is the criteria? What values do we want? Do we care about somebody's ethnicity when they come here, right? What does assimilation look like? I just think we haven't really resolved this, but that's actually what is on the table right now. Every time the Trump administration talks about immigration, this is what's at stake.
Well, and I'll say, at the Bush Institute, because we do talk about this a lot, I actually do have recommendations on what our immigration policy should look like. And, I do think that in people who work on immigration policy, we also dislike the 1965 law, but for different reasons. We think it doesn't work for who we are today, just as people were saying when they were trying to pass it, that the 1924 law didn't work for who we were in that moment in time. And so, there's work to be done there. I did see so many parallels in your book between debates that they were having then and debates that they're having now. And one of the things that really struck me was even pre-1924, there is a story about we didn't allow Japanese immigrants to naturalize. So there's a story in there about a man who decided to petition for his own naturalization and defend himself in court. And he didn't argue the law, but he did argue about who he was. And so he was saying things that you hear dreamers say today, dreamers being young people who were brought here by their parents illegally, so they're undocumented. They don't have the opportunity to become citizens in most cases either. And he's saying, I'm fundamentally an American. I would lay down my life for this country. I love being here. This is who I am. And so we're still having that conversation. We're just having it with a different group of people now.
Very much. And, that case for me is really, it's just, I'll never forget it really. So it's this, it's this man who immigrates from Japan, like in the early 1900s. He comes to California for his education, and he ends up in Hawaii with a family. He marries, has children, gets a job working for a big sugar company. And at a certain point, I don't know what moves him, but he starts thinking, I want to become an American citizen. Like, I've been here long enough. I love this country. I'm all in on that. And essentially he decides to show up in Honolulu at a courthouse to petition for citizenship. Now, the problem is, at this moment in the 1920s, our naturalization law says only two kinds of people can become citizens. So from the very early days of the founding of this country, free whites, in quotes, could naturalize, but no one else. After the Civil War, after the Black slaves are freed, they're added. So you can only naturalize if you are white or you're African American. So this Asian man shows up and they don't know what to do with him because he's neither white nor Black. And so he basically represents himself in court to challenge this. And he basically takes it all the way to the Supreme Court and says, I should be able to naturalize. And he represents himself. And so he writes these very moving briefs about how it's not about the color of my skin, it's about what's in my heart. And Laura, you're right. This is exactly how people describe it now. They talk about the need to see something beyond the color of their skin. And it's about values. It's about being American as transcending the color of your skin. And in his case, so this man is named Takao Ozawa, he gets to the Supreme Court and he goes before the justices and they basically say, we're sorry, you seem like a perfectly fine person. You seem like a great contributor to your community and our society, but you're not white. So, you're clearly not Black, so you can't become a citizen. And it's not until 1952 that Asian immigrants can naturalize. And so that fight too, I think we take for granted, and I took for granted before I worked on the book, that my parents could naturalize. And that was a political fight that had to be won. And again, I would argue can be undone too, right? We had laws that said you can't naturalize if you're not white. Now we say that you can, but these are all laws that we collectively decide, and people can change them again.
And, I think this really sort of touches on assimilation. So I'm going to go to an audience question here because, this man wasn't allowed to naturalize, but for all intents and purposes, for everything that we would consider to be someone who's assimilated and would be a good contributor to our community, he wasn't allowed to be fully American by naturalizing. And so the question is, for many European immigrants, they placed a big emphasis on assimilation, especially by their children. Is this true today? Why or why not? And I would add, I would say, looking at your book, this argument comes up over and over that these communities aren't going to assimilate. They have newspapers in their own languages. They're totally different from us. They live in enclaves and cities away from everybody else. So, what's your response to that in terms of how we think about assimilation today?
I think we're in really kind of an unusual spot because, one thing that I learned is that, yes, this assimilation debate has come up before. And so I think we take for granted as well that people whose grandparents came from Italy or Eastern Europe, they seem assimilated now. They seem like white Americans. I'd say that's kind of how we conceive of whiteness now. It includes, if you're Jewish, you basically are considered white. But during this time when they start coming, starting from the 1880s, they seem very different to people. They don't seem white, actually. They seem like they're not assimilating. And so there are questions around, well, they're speaking Yiddish, they have this different religion, they're not Protestant. And again, like earlier waves faced similar questions, Germans who came, the food they're eating, the Irish and Catholics. I think for those of you in the audience whose families are Catholic, for a long time, right, Catholic Americans were considered kind of alien and different and treated with a great deal of suspicion. And so I think in a way, assimilation for these Americans, a lot of it comes from World War II. They fight in the war. And I think the military traditionally in our history has actually is a very powerful force for what we think of as assimilation, right? Because there's nothing quite like being willing to die for your country to establish that you are part of the country. And so for these earlier waves of immigrants from other parts of Europe, I just think we have to remember they were considered not assimilated. And over time, they became, they were accepted into American society. But at the beginning, they seemed, just as different as a Middle Eastern family or a Muslim family might seem to us right now. And I think what's so tricky about the current moment is this question of, well, back then the idea was, okay, these are people from all over Europe. And this is where the melting pot analogy comes from, right? Like all these European races or ethnicities are blended together into one big stew. Now we have people from all over the world. I mean, every country, the borough of Queens in New York probably has someone from literally every country in the world. What does assimilation look like now? Is it speaking the English language? Is it the food you eat? Is it, is it how you worship? Is it whether you vote? Is it where you go to school? Like, all of these questions are kind of on the table. And so I think we just have to think of our country as one that has over time consistently had people from all around the world. They first show up, no one knows what to make of them. They seem so different. And over time, they do become part of the American project, but we have never had this many people from outside of Europe. And so I think one of the questions we kind of have to collectively ask ourselves is, if people are from outside Europe, and they're not going to become maybe white in the way that past waves have come over, all of these categories keep changing. What does assimilation look like now? And I think we just haven't really answered those questions. But I think about my own family, and assimilation for us looked like, my parents are retired, but they spent years in the federal government as civil servants. My father worked for the Department of Commerce, and he helped, he did a lot on trade and protecting North Carolina furniture makers, for instance, who were being really beaten out of their businesses by Chinese competitors. And he himself is Chinese, but it was a way of being like, I'm an American citizen. I stand with my fellow Americans. I'm devoting my career to public service. Even when I'm on the opposite table from, Chinese civil servants, I've picked a side. I'm American. And so, for my family, it looks like that. And for many others, it looks a different way. But I think, again, we haven't really figured out, what does assimilation look like in 2020?
Well, and I would say, from a data perspective, we actually do know that current waves of immigrants do assimilate into what we would consider a pretty standard definition of assimilation now. We hear a lot of times arguments that, oh, they're not learning English. And we know actually that one of the reasons that people think that current waves of immigrants are not learning English is we haven't actually seen the end of the wave. So what happens is a group of people comes over, everyone has the same arguments. Oh, I keep seeing all these people speaking German, or I keep seeing all these people speaking Spanish, and they're never learning. But we know that they place a heavy emphasis on their children learning English, regardless of where they're from. We know that in the next generation, most of those children think of themselves as typical Americans. And so we do see that, that progression happens with every single group. It's just that you have to get to the end of the wave for people to calm down a little bit about it and be less anxious, because that's when you start to see that the full immersion into the American experience. And I would also note, assimilation is not a one-way street. We are very much, as native-born Americans, also impacted by what immigrants bring in very positive ways. I mean, I think in the mid-90s is when sales of salsa overtook sales of ketchup. And I don't know that anyone really is complaining about that. Those are good things. And those are things that really matter.
Yeah. And
all of our daily
food,
experiences.
hamburgers, hamburgers, hot dogs come from Germans. So yeah, this country is I just think just have a very unusual country. Like and I wonder even in the history of civilizations, like if there's ever been any country that had this sort of unusual project where people just come from all over and we're just constantly blending our cultures together, which is, I think, very difficult to do, but we've carried it off in all kinds of ways that I think we don't actually give ourselves enough credit for.
So if you joined us late, we were talking to Jia Lynn Yang about her new book, One Mighty and Irresistible Tide. You mentioned before I took that audience question about the 1952 law and what it did for Asian naturalization. And there's an interesting fight in your book on that because you have a whole wave of people who are trying to overturn the 1924 quotas through 1952. But the 1952 law actually renews the quotas. But there's one group of people who is advocating for its passage that really stands out, and that is Japanese Americans. And it's because of this one portion of the law, because the quotas weren't good for them either, but it would allow the ones who were already here to naturalize. And that was a huge victory for them. But, I think it highlights, there was this lack of coming together of groups and to find a solution that would have benefited everybody. Do you see parallels to that to our current political discourse on immigration policy?
I do. So it's this, there's kind of 3 points in my book that are really historically significant. There's 1924, 1965, which we've talked about. In between, there's 1952. And, immigration reform, as you know very full well, Laura, is like, it just takes years to come. It's like it's not quite once in a generation, but it's like, it can take decades, and we're still waiting right now. Like we're just wildly overdue, of course. And 1952 is one of those moments where it's like, okay, we're going to look at the whole system. We're going to put everything on the table. We're going to think about, is this working? What do we change? What do we not? And so all the people who oppose the quotas rush in at this moment and say, okay, we fought the war. We've seen the Holocaust. We've got to get rid of these quotas. And they all rush in and try to change these laws and overturn the quotas. They lose. But within this debate, there's a whole mini debate about naturalization for Asian immigrants. And the people in the middle of that are Japanese Americans who saw their families placed in internment camps during the war. They are people who fought, again, we're talking assimilation through fighting in a war. They volunteer to fight in a regiment in Europe. They die for the US, even though they're Japanese and their parents can't naturalize. And in 1952, they are part of this debate too. And essentially within this whole outcome, which reaffirms the quotas, and so the people who want to overturn them lose very badly, and it's this huge loss for them. Within that, there is, though, this development where Asian immigrants are allowed to naturalize. And this is the result of really powerful lobbying from these Japanese Americans who are saying, I fought in the war, my brother, literally, like there's a man in the middle, Mike Masaoka, his brother dies in the war. Mm-hmm. I risked my life. And my mother here, who's a Japanese immigrant, she's getting older, and I want her to be able to naturalize and become an American citizen before she dies. And so it's this very moving quest to win naturalization rights, because that's how important it is to these people that they become American, right? You can think like it's sort of a piece of paper. Like his mom, I don't think after she naturalizes, does her life change significantly? Like I'm not sure it does. It's not about getting benefits. It's like the symbolic way of saying like you belong, like you're an American too. And so in the middle of this fight, he does win naturalization rights for Asian immigrants, which is a huge deal, right? My parents wouldn't have been able to naturalize without this. This is a watershed moment in our country, but the quota system is reaffirmed and stands until finally 1965 it's taken out. But again, it's this huge moment, decades in the making, and with mixed results.
Can you talk a little bit about how 1952 really catalyzed 1965? And, you don't get a bill like this without people coming together. And, President Johnson was such a huge I don't want to say character. He's such a huge person in all of this throughout. He appears before even we're talking about the 1952 bill. He appears when he's in Congress. He's trying to help Jewish refugees get admitted to the U.S. So can you talk a little bit about how really the coalition ended up being built to, push through this law that's had such a huge impact on the rest of immigration policy in the U.S.?
I think what's really interesting to learn, or what struck me as surprising, is we hear this phrase, a nation of immigrants, so much. And I think we've not really asked ourselves, so where does this phrase even come from? And it comes out of this fight in the 1950s. It's part of this sort of new history being written often by the children of these Jewish and Italian immigrants who came at the turn of the century, to say like the Central American spirit is the spirit of its immigrants. That was a thing that had to be introduced. That was a new idea. And I'd argue it's a very powerful kind of nationalist idea, right? It's this like mythology of like who we are as a country is we are immigrants. There's something very radical about that too, right? It's like, I think we think of nationalism as usually about being maybe more nativist, being more anti-immigrant. This turns it on its head. It says, actually what makes us America is the fact that we have all these foreigners. That's the heart of who we are. And that's introduced by historians, and it's taken up by people like JFK, who famously writes a pamphlet, later turned into a book called A Nation of Immigrants. And so the people who are trying to overturn the quotas begin to embrace this new kind of mythology and nationalist idea about a nation of immigrants. And it's a coalition of, Jewish Americans, Italian Americans, it's Asian Americans, it's people, it's many actually Christian leaders, people who are really concerned about refugees and are sponsoring refugees. This is a moment where mainline Protestants are actually deeply involved in immigration policymaking. And together, on the backs of this new sort of moral argument that we owe it to ourselves as a nation to continue to be a nation of immigrants, this is how they get the 1965 law, because they say, we're fighting the Cold War, we're a nation of immigrants, we are proud that we are a nation of immigrants, we can't have these quotas. And so together, this coalition is really what's behind the 1965 law. And it has people like, one of the major characters in my book is this man named Manny Seller, who's a Brooklyn congressman, grandson of German Jews who came in the late 1800s. All of his constituents in Brooklyn are immigrants, children of immigrants, people like him. And he joins Congress in the 20s. So he sees from the very beginning these quotas passed, and he's still there. I mean, he's there. When he leaves Congress, Nixon is president. So he's there for the whole thing.
He was a mainstay. He was part of the building at that point.
Yeah, exactly. And he's, I think, maybe like the 5th longest serving member of the House in American history. I mean, he's there the whole time, but he spends his whole career really trying to change these immigration laws. And he's part of this coalition too. And LBJ is fascinating as well. He's not someone who you'd imagine as being really pro-immigrant, but he teaches Mexican American kids when he's just graduated from college and a teacher himself. And he also, this is a moment where he's passing a lot of civil rights legislation. And he really kind of seizes the moral moment in the country when JFK is killed. He basically takes a lot of unfinished business from the Kennedy White House, including immigration reform, and just really powerfully pushes all of it through Congress. So I think that's why we don't hear about this law as much as I think we should, because there's so much else to pay attention to. There's the Voting Rights Act, there's the Civil Rights Act, there's just so much happening. And for LBJ, this was just one more bill that he's passing. And I don't know that he fully realizes how important it is or how transformative it's going to be, but it's part of this wave of civil rights legislation. And it's in a way the same coalition that's behind all of these laws. And they're all about civil rights. They're all about human equality, and immigration is very much part of it.
So I'm going to go to a couple of audience questions. I'm going to combine them and put a little different spin on them, mostly because I think that this is really addressed in your book in a couple of different ways. And, one of the arguments against immigration is they're taking our jobs. There's also always the question of, are they an economic benefit or an economic drag? Are those arguments that in your research you saw across time, or is that a new argument against immigration?
It's always going on. And what's so interesting is that you see, just as you do right now, a lot of the people who are pro-immigration are business interests. And so in the 1920s, I'll pause and describe a bit sort of how we thought about the US-Mexico border, because that's all we think about now. But, it wasn't quite as, I would say very quickly, like in the past, we only thought of, when you said immigrant, people thought about Europe. And now we don't, right? But to understand the context of my book, it's all about Europe. And in a way, they kind of don't realize that the future is not going to be about Europe at all. But when they did talk about the border, in fact, they kept the border open. There were no numerical limits. Even after 1924, they're limiting the rest of the world. But in fact, they're looking at their neighbors. And I think as an act of foreign policy, they just say it would be offensive to say to Mexico, we don't want your people here. So the border is kept open. And it also, when people raise this during the debate, they say, well, wait a second, if we don't want Jews and Italians and Asians. We shouldn't want Mexicans either. They don't fit our culture. There were agricultural interests that pushed back and said, we've got to have a free motion over this border back and forth seasonally of agricultural workers, and we just can't reject them. And so over and over, you see business interests that are pro-immigration, much as you do now. Labor movements too. The labor unions were very much anti-immigrant for a long time because they said these people are competing with us for jobs, and we don't want them here. And one of the primary movers of 65, what sort of flips the switch, is that labor changes sides. They actually become pro-immigrant. They basically, the AFL-CIO says, we are actually going to be pro-immigrant. We have a lot of members who are themselves immigrants or children of immigrants. These laws are discriminatory. We can't stand by them. And they embrace the cause too. And so, but this question of workers and competition for jobs, always on the table, and very much, in our history, every time we talk about immigration, we talk about jobs too.
Yeah, and I can say from the work the Bush Institute does, we actually do know immigration is good for the economy. It's basically a no-brainer. Almost every economist agrees. If economists were setting immigration policy, we'd have a much more open and system, and we'd take in more people, because that population growth actually helps grow our labor force and helps our productivity. And that's actually, funny enough, one of the arguments that was made against the quotas and trying to overturn the quotas is there were people already out there saying, our population's dwindling. We need to get more fresh blood in here and really help rejuvenate the United States. I wanted you mentioned your book is so much focused on Europe, and that people weren't really considering, when we think about immigration now, we really think about, Mexican immigration or Latin American immigration generally, or Asian immigration, but people were so focused on Europe. And so one of the audience questions here, I think, is related to that. This is, how does the immigration issue interact with or influence the current racial situation and its resolution? Which is a very difficult question. And I think we could have an entire other forum on that alone. But briefly, from your perspective, what do you think about the way that issue interacts?
I think this is the heart of it. I mean, I think about, I'll just speak personally. I'm Asian American, and I've been thinking too, I mean, we at the sort of the beginning of this pandemic, there was this huge rise in anti-Asian xenophobia. We saw a lot of anti-Asian hate crimes. And at the Times, I edited a front page piece about this. And it led to a lot of soul searching in the Asian American community. And I think part of what we have to talk about, again, as a country collectively, is that we have all these people now who aren't Black or white, right? Like the racial landscape of the country has historically been Black, white as sort of these like poles that are constantly establishing kind of the basics of America's racial landscape. And when immigrants come, traditionally, these European immigrants that I've been talking about, they try to become white. And there are ways that they do it in opposition to being Black. They're like, I'm not Black, I'm white. And Italian Americans in particular, like at the very beginning, a lot of the racial slurs against them were calling them essentially African and Black. The term Guinea is actually a reference to the West African slave trade. So that is how not white they seemed. And so to become white, they really had to sort of say, like, I seem Black, again, shocking to our knowledge now. We think Italians are obviously white, but at the time they were really considered so unassimilable and not part of America that they were basically called Black. And over time, of course, that changed, and now they're considered white. But I think for Asian Americans, for Hispanics in this country, people who are like me, American born, people who are immigrants, there's just this constant question of like, where do we fit? Like, where do we fit if America's traditionally been Black versus white? Like, where do we go? And there's a lot of conversation around in our education system, right? You think about the fights over affirmative action for Asian Americans, and a lot of them feel like, well, I'm sort of considered white in this context because I have all these advantages, but there are ways in which many Asian Americans actually have no advantages. They're quite poor. I think about Hmong Americans, right? Like, these are people I think the stereotype for a lot of us for Asian Americans are highly educated, doctors and engineers. I would add that's largely because our immigration laws selected for that. Like my parents have graduate degrees, and it's not because Asian Americans
Not
all
an
have better
accident.
degrees.
It was domestic policy.
Yeah, we specifically
selected for that.
We specifically wanted people like this, right? Like how else to explain why all the Chinese immigrants before were working on railroads and now they're all doctors and engineers? It's not because Chinese people changed, it's because we selected for people like this. But for Asian Americans, it's this category that's sort of tenuous and funny. It includes highly educated, right, Indian American doctors and engineers, and also Hmong refugees who show up totally penniless. I'm thinking about them in Minneapolis right now, right? Like one of the cops involved is Hmong American. Mm-hmm. They live in public housing with African Americans in Minneapolis. Like they're having a totally different experience. So who are they, right? And what does it mean to have people from the Middle East, from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, who are neither Black nor white? And, you know, people like my family, we have to kind of carve out where we fit in this racial landscape. And I think, again, tons of unfinished business here. Like, what does that mean? We're not going to become white. we just, you know, like that Supreme Court case I mentioned, that man tried to argue that he could become a citizen and they said, you're just not white and you're never going to be. So I don't know. I guess I answer your question with more questions, but I think this is sort of the root of it. When we have this many people from around the world who don't fit these categories, how do we update them? How do we think about race in a different way?
Well, and to that, you know, how do we use that part of the conversation when we think about what we want immigration policy to look like moving forward? You know, there's a part in your book where, you know, they've been trying for so long to overturn the quotas, and then they don't actually know what they want to put in place of the quotas. And so, you know, how do we use those lessons in the conversations we're having today and really inform where immigration policy goes in the future?
Yeah, I think that moment is so funny. It's like, it's happening. So Kennedy is president, you know, and he's run on this pretty pro-immigration platform of saying these quotas are discriminatory. He's written a Nation of Immigrants pamphlet. He's all in, and they're sitting down. They're like, okay, it's time to propose the bill. And everyone's like, but what do we replace it with? Like, if we don't have these quotas, what are we going to do? And they don't really know because it's really complicated, right? I think what strikes me about the political debate right now is I feel like it's often sort of stuck. It's like, you know, Democrats are often saying like the Trump White House is anti-immigrant. It's inhumane to separate families. We're not about that. We're about something else. We love immigrants. And then I always wonder, so let's establish you don't want to do what Trump is doing. You don't like what Stephen Miller is doing. So what is your platform? What is your plan? Because simply saying we love immigrants is like, okay, well, let's get past the slogans of a nation of immigrants. Like what? So when you get to the hard questions of like, who is going to come here? You know, you first have to ask yourself, do we want open borders? Which might sound radical, but that's actually historically what we had. So you first have to answer the question, do we want open borders? We've done it before. It's really what built this country for the first, 200 years, really. Do we want, or not 150 years, let's say, it's open borders. Do you want that? If you don't want that, you're going to have to answer very hard questions about who comes in and who doesn't. And then you have to ask yourself, so what do we want from immigration? What are we going to prioritize? Is it job skills? Is it refugee status? Are we taking the people who are the most persecuted? And we're not taking the wealthy, highly educated person who's going to be fine if they stay in their country. Are we taking the people with the least? Are we taking people, we've done this traditionally, if you think of the Vietnamese and the Hmong, are we going to take people who are in countries where we have foreign policy, where we're fighting wars, right? So if you're Iraqi and you help the US military, are you ahead in line of somebody who hasn't worked with the US military? So you're gonna have to, I think, if you're not gonna have open borders, you have to have very hard conversations about who comes in and who doesn't. And it just strikes me that I think like the left and Democratic Party don't really get there. They're kind of stuck at, we're not Trump, but then my next question is, so what are you for? And I don't think anyone, if you look at Joe Biden's platform, it's very murky what the system would actually be if he were in charge, I think.
And, I think that it's in this moment in time that ends up being a party issue, but as your book shows, and I think as recent history, even as recent as 2013, this was really not so much a party line issue. It was very bipartisan, and that there were people in both parties who were really fighting this. Sometimes they were fighting for more immigrants, sometimes they're fighting against, but they were intra-party battles rather than starkly along party lines. And so, this is a topic that's always evolving and changing. We have a lot of audience questions, and I wish I could get to all of them. We could talk for a lot longer. I have one last substantive question for you. If we have time, I'll try to take one more. What do you want people who read this book to take away from it? What do you want them to, is there a call to action or something that you want them to take away from this experience in this book?
I think what's really important to me that I learned that I'm going to keep with me from the experience of working on this book is that this whole legal system we've created of immigration is just that. It's a legal system. It's the product of political battles. It's the product of political choices. It's the product of presidents, lawmakers, activists, everyday Americans saying this is what it means to be American. And ultimately, these are pieces of paper. So if my family had tried to come in 1900, there's no way we could have come. We came after the 1965 law, so we were allowed to come. And so these things are kind of left, I think we tend to think of immigration as like these very, I think many American families have almost this mythology about how your family came. And those are very powerful stories. And I think they're very moving stories. I always just love hearing, anyone I meet, I just want to know, how did your family get here? Because everybody has this incredible dramatic story of how their family got here. I think though that we tell those stories over and over, but we're forgetting the other half of the story, which is, why was your family allowed to come? What were the laws that allowed them to come? It wasn't destiny that they were going to be automatically allowed. And I look at my own family, we were not automatically, we had laws that banned Chinese immigration, that banned naturalization. So how did we get from there to now, my whole extended family is here and we're all Americans, right? Like, I think for me, I learned not to take for granted that there was political struggle behind these facts. And as a result of knowing that these are things that were man-made, they can be undone. There's nothing that says a family like mine should still be able to come 10 years from now. There's nothing that says that. We have these papers that say that we're American, but they're ultimately pieces of paper and they can be undone. And I think the lessons of Germany, frankly, and the Holocaust tell you that you can be a German Jew who's assimilated fully. You can be in that country for how many generations? And all it takes is overnight someone can say, those papers don't mean anything anymore. You're no longer a citizen. And so I'm not trying to scaremonger. I'm just really trying to say that these are laws that we make that change over time. They're always up for debate. And right now we have people in power who want to change the terms of it. They want to change who gets to be here. And I don't come again with answers on what it should look like, but I think for me, what I learned is that, again, this dial can be turned back and forth. And each of us, all of our families, depending on when you try to come, the outcome could have been incredibly different. And I think just to come to the debate with that humility and that understanding is for me the most powerful thing I learned.
Fantastic. Well, we've come to the end of our program today. Thank you to everyone for joining, whether you're watching us via C-SPAN, or whether you're with the Dallas-Fort Worth World Affairs Council or one of the World Affairs Council chapters around the country. We're so excited you joined us today. The book is called One Mighty and Irresistible Tide. Please go out and purchase this book. I think it's wonderful. I've read it myself. It's full of great information.
Thanks so much for having me.